once you can find the connecting tissue, you know you've got a book. And even if that's only a couple of scenes and a couple of threads that connect them, provided that that initial underpinning is stable, you can then expand in both directions as far as you want, really. Hi, I'm Jock Serong. I'm the author of Cherrywood, which is out now through HarperCollins. Cherrywood is two stories which are wrapped around each other. And one is a story from around 1920, which is the tale of a guy called Thomas Renfeather, who comes from Scotland to Melbourne with a bit of a dream. And the dream has to do with this very mysterious load of cherry timber from which he's going to make a paddle steamer. And his dream is that he will sail this paddle steamer on Port Phillip Bay and have lovely afternoon functions, and Melbourne society will come out to enjoy all of this, and things, as you might imagine, don't quite go as he's hoping. The other story is a young woman named Martha, who's a commercial solicitor in Melbourne, in the city, in 1993, and that year becomes very important. Martha is very, very gifted, but she's also lonely, and her dream job has turned out to be kind of hollow. And Martha is adrift. And one night on her way between her work and a dinner party in the northern suburbs, she stops at a pub to buy a bottle of wine, and the pub is very, very strange. And Martha's life changes from that moment forward. So these two stories are alternating in the telling, but they're also heading towards each other as the book progresses. Genre is a really difficult question. I think I don't think about it at all in the writing. I think about whether a story has got its hooks in me and whether I'm having fun. And once I've determined that I'm having fun, I then start worrying in the subsequent drafts about, okay, how do I get the reader to have fun here? And long after all of those difficult questions have been answered, somebody will say, okay, what shelf do we put this thing on? And I think if you worry too much about genre, you're putting the cart before the horse, because you're trying to create the tropes that that genre reader wants to see. And I can't do it that way around. I come up with the images and the scenes and the ideas that please me, and then somebody else has to figure out how you shelf those. And I guess if I was to have a stab at this, I would say that it is historical fiction about history that never happened, or it's, what else is it? It's travelogue, because Martha and Thomas are both moving. Yeah, it's definitely a departure for me, because I had spent 6 or 8 years writing a trilogy about Bass Strait history. And the key to that trilogy, because it was so involved with First Nations questions and talking about the frontier, it was very, very important that it be historically accurate. So I had to research the hell out of everything. I had to consult a lot with First Nations people, and I had to second guess everything I did. It's all built off events that happened, that trilogy. And at the end of that process, it was very important that it happened that way. But at the end of the process, as a writer, I felt desperate to come back to the idea of making up a story. I had gone a long way from that position, and I really wanted to not rely on research and to excavate whatever it was that was inside my head, and to see whether it struck a chord with other people. And it's a really risky, thrilling kind of process for an author, because you don't know. It's possible that the stuff that's rattling around in your head is only amusing you. And you're taking a punt on the idea that it will find something in a complete stranger. Thomas Renfeather comes from a lot of the reading that I like to do. I like to mix my reading between the things that are being released currently, and I probably have a bias towards Australian writers, and then going way back into other traditions. And I've been reading a lot of Peter Carey and a lot of Dickens in the last couple of years. And I think if you look carefully at the way the Thomas Renfeather passages are written, they read more in a traditional novelistic style. They're a bit more Dickensian, or a bit more Carey, I suppose. And the voice is just that little bit different to when I'm writing the Martha passages. So that gives Thomas a particular sepia tint that was what I was probably looking for. I knew I had a book when I knew I had enough scenes that could reach each other. So I don't start with a map. I start with one or two images that I can see very clearly. And here I could see the paddle steamer very clearly. And I could see Martha going into this strange pub because it came from a dream in the first place. And once I knew I had a handful of those and that there was a way of connecting one to another, that they weren't too disparate to ever join, once you can find the connecting tissue, you know you've got a book. And even if that's only a couple of scenes and a couple of threads that connect them, provided that that initial underpinning is stable, you can then expand in both directions as far as you want, really. So I think, yeah, the moment Martha walks into the pub, the moment Thomas watches the paddle steamer go down the slipway, I think I felt like I was probably on. And from there, I just had to work out how those two ideas were going to reach each other. There were all sorts of paddle steamers. There are certainly a lot of paddle steamers that have plied the Murray. As for Port Phillip Bay, there were a few, but they were really concentrated at the southern end. So they were around places like Mornington and Sorrento and Queenscliff, I think. And it's really surprising to me. This is this idea of history that never happened, that I really, when I researched it, I couldn't believe that nobody had done what Thomas was trying to do, which was to have an excursion paddle steamer that went between St Kilda and Williamstown in the city. And you have a brass band and you have a chef knocking out food and everyone has a great afternoon. That seems to me to be a bit of a no-brainer. And yet, it never happened. The way that I accumulated knowledge for this story is different to the way I've done it in other novels. And here there was this broad rule that I had for myself, which was that I wasn't going to go getting lost in research again. So I really didn't look up very much. And there will be train spotters who will look at this paddle steamer stuff and say, hang on, that's not right, which is okay, because what matters here is that we are all taking leave of reality and we're taking a little trip. And whether it should have been a side wheel or a stern wheel paddle steamer, or whether it should have burned red gum or coal, is completely beside the point. So I was lucky enough that I went into a secondhand bookshop in Camberwell and wandered around all the shelves, and I looked at rivers and I looked at maritime and I looked at history, and I couldn't flush out anything about paddle steamers. And I said to the guy behind the counter, do you happen to have anything on paddle steamers? And he did that wonderful bookseller thing where he went and got a ladder and he wandered off and he put the ladder up to a shelf and he reached around up under the ceiling and he pulled out one hardcover book, which was A History of Australian Paddle Steamers. And it was all I needed. It gave me enough to know the visuals and a bit of the structure, not a lot of the structure, and a sense of how passengers might have moved around, which is very important to the paddle steamer scenes, how people occupied the vessel. So I thought that's as much as I want, is a bit of guidance without having checked everything. I know a little bit about law because I practiced it for 17 years and I did all sorts of different things. And I think in retrospect, I was a kid at school who only ever wanted to be a writer, and I'm now a writer. And in between was this large part of my life where I was doing something else, but I was trying desperately to make stories out of it. So I would do all the things I could think of that were storytelling law. So I did native title, which meant that I was out in the desert talking to the Mardu people about their stories and making those stories into a claim. I did lots of crime work where I generally defended. So I was trying to convey an accused story to a jury or to a judge. I worked with asylum seekers where I would try to explain how somebody wound up on the boat. And all of those things really were about collecting stories and delivering them as well as they could be delivered. So when you then, thereafter becoming a writer, you can't use those stories because they're all given in confidence. But what you can do is think about the structure of how those stories come together and you can replicate that. It's been fascinating that the book is deliberately strange, and people, particularly my publisher, have said this strange thing happened to me when I was dealing with the book, reading the book. Mates have sent me text messages saying the oddest thing just happened. And I don't buy into this at all, but I think what it does do, there was a mate who drove through the back streets of Fitzroy and his GPS just suddenly gave up on him and wouldn't tell him where he was. And he rang me up and he said, I think it's happening. um, I think what it does, hopefully, is that the storytelling puts the reader in a mind where weird things are possible in an urban environment. And weird things are possible in an urban environment. Every time, particularly in Fitzroy, every time you walk past a ghost sign on a building, there's all these other lives that were there, or a bricked up doorway, or a laneway that's been reconfigured. So it's history constantly overwriting itself. And that leaves all these weird gaps that there's plenty of room to fall into. A lot of the pub scenes in Cherrywood will be recognisable to Melbourne people as the Napier in Fitzroy, which is exactly the internal dimensions that I was working to in coming up with the Cherrywood. Only the Napier's brick, the Cherrywood's timber. And I always felt about the Napier that it had this TARDIS-like effect where it's very small externally, but internally it had all these different rooms and staircases, and you could get a restaurant and a public bar and a band into this one space that was tiny. And in retrospect, I'm not sure how that worked. Cherrywood is my seventh novel. So my debut was a fairly conventional crime novel called Quota, which is about set in a town called Dauphin, which is a very poorly disguised version of my hometown of Port Fairy. I then wrote a novel called The Rules of Backyard Cricket, which is both a sporting novel and not a sporting novel. It's really, I think at its deeper level, it's about the perils of celebrity. About two brothers who become very famous for doing a thing that they only wanted to do for its own sake, and the ways that it affects them as people, as adults. And also the perils of never being told no, which I think is what happens to athletes. After Backyard, my third novel was On the Java Ridge, which was based a lot on my experiences working with asylum seekers and also my life as a surfer. I think I was trying at the time. I'd read Breath by Tim Winton and I'd read Barbarian Days by William Finnegan. And I was interested in the notion of writing good fiction about surfing. It's almost impossible because surfing is just a morass of cliches. And so I started out trying to write a surfing novel. And then in the middle of it, my anger about the way we treat asylum seekers started to boil over. And I thought, these surfing boats are going to the same islands where these asylum boats are coming from. How have they never met each other? And surely there's a story in what would happen if they did. So the two ideas merged, which is a thing that often happens, I think, when you're making novels. And then after Java Ridge, I wrote the trilogy. So the trilogy is based around an island called Flinders Island in Bass Strait, which is part of a group called the Furneaux Group. And the way in which the Furneaux Group went from being the ancient lands of Aboriginal people to being uninhabited, to then being discovered by Europeans, and to then getting caught up in the dispossession of Tasmania's Aborigines. That whole process tells you really, really important things about what we did across the continent. It's like a microcosm for all these other things that happened. And in a very, very short space of time, really in 50 years. So I started out wanting to write a novel that explained that. And given that it's a 50-year window, I thought, I'll write this about one person's life. And I must have been days or weeks in when I realised there's 3 novels and this is far too big. So that became a trilogy. And that took me through kind of 2017 to about 2022. And since then, it's been Cherrywood. I think the thing I read recently that struck me the most was Question 7 by Richard Flanagan. And for 2 reasons. One is that authenticity, that sincerity that's in it. The voice is speaking so honestly. But the other is the boldness of form. It's impossible to tell what it is. And I'm reading a book at the moment called Chinese Postman by Brian Castro, which does a similar thing. You're not quite sure where you're being taken, but the language is so good and the sentiments are so powerful that you don't mind. At the moment, I'm writing a biography of Fletcher Jones. And in fact, when I walked in today, I noticed there's a Fletcher Jones outlet just up the road. So I've been working on this for about 6 months, and I am lost in the research and just fascinated and having a ball. It's a real departure writing nonfiction and writing biography. So I'm enjoying figuring out how to do that. It feels like every time you start a new book, you're trying to teach yourself a new discipline. And I would hate for it to be any other way. I love that. So I've got to do that. I'm in the middle of writing a history of the Port Fairy Folk Festival, which will be more of a hardcover coffee table type book, a lot of photos. And so that's a commission for the Folkie because they've got their 50th anniversary coming up. And that involves the community down there and talking to lots of fascinating volunteers and musos and good fun. And then behind those two projects, there's two novels that are just sort of bubbling away on the back burners, but they're early days and almost impossible to describe. They're a mess. It's a great pleasure, Katy. Thank you for having me.